Shall we begin?
Why would a good God allow suffering to exist? Does God really exist?
Let's begin now.
Why did God command the deaths of so many people in the Bible? Why does God remain so hidden? On February the 16th, Parliament is putting forth a motion to condemn Islamophobia. We have with us today Dr. Tony Costa and Dr. Scott Masson. What really is Islamophobia?
Well, Islamophobia is a phrase that has been interpreted to mean that any criticism of Islam or criticism of anything related to Islam would constitute Islamophobia. The only problem, of course, is that the way that Parliament is currently phrasing this term in the Motion 103, they leave it undefined. They don't define what exactly Islamophobia is. The roots of this word, many believe, stems from a Muslim think tank in the United States that sought to use the term as a means to silence criticism of Islam. This was admitted by a Muslim who is still a Muslim, but is considered a moderate who opposes Islamic extremism. And so the term itself seems to have originated in the context of, in a sense, imitating the LGBTQ community in their use of homophobia to silence criticism of same-sex attraction or same-sex relationships, transgender, etc., and use the same terminology to silence any critics of Islam. But the word itself is very problematic. A phobia is an irrational fear of something. And so we don't want to be irrational about things, we want to be rational. So the major problem here is it's a vacuous term because it is not properly defined. What is that word? It doesn't define it.
Yeah. So Dr. Masson, what would you think the origins of Islamophobia, where it stems from?
It's the same thing. I mean, I agree with Tony. It is a relatively new term. It does piggyback on other ideas of phobias. It's a Freudian term, so it's an irrational fear. If it is an irrational fear, then I don't know how you can legally prohibit it. How can you prevent people from having an irrational fear? And that's part of the problem with the term, is that there's a sense that we're prohibiting it because there's more than an irrational fear. There's a conscious bias in place here, and we want to curtail that or sanction it in some way. But as Tony said, there is no specifically defined position of what that phobia is. So because of that, it can be whatever the offended party wants it to be. So it opens the possibility of litigation almost endlessly, and of course the grounds for experiencing this are just simply subjective. So I can charge you with being an Islamophobe, and I can silence you. And I guess if this law or if this motion becomes a legal thing, then there might be criminal sanctions behind it as well. So it's thoroughly problematic. It's the fact that it's so fuzzy. It suggests that it's irrational on the one hand, but if it's going to be a legal thing, then it can't be irrational. So it's a muddle from start to finish. And in which case you think, why would this even get off the ground? Well, it's politics, for one thing, because interestingly, the third party in Canada, the NDP, they proposed this actually last year, and the Liberals, who are the governing party, voted against it. And now they're in favor of it, and everybody's, they want it to be unanimous and so forth. So it's clearly political, but it's got far more teeth than people would like for a gesture. Yeah.
The massacre in Quebec has also exacerbated the situation in the Quebec mosque. And so because of that, there's an emotional response, and this is most likely going to cause the members of Parliament to pass this motion. And of course, we openly, categorically condemn what happened in Quebec.
Yes, sure.
We condemn all forms of violence, whether it is perpetrated against Muslims or Christians or Jews or whoever it may be. As Christians, we hold that all human beings are made in the imago Dei, they're made in the image of God. and therefore we openly join our voices to those who condemn this great atrocity. But I think what we need to do is we need to think this clearly. What are the ramifications of this motion? What's going to happen if it does pass? Are certain Muslims going to be charged with being Islamophobic? Because, for instance, there's a group of Muslims called the Ahmadiyas, and the Ahmadiyas differ from the mainstream in believing that the founder of their group, Mirza Ahmad Ghulam, they believe that he is the Mahdi, the promised Messiah, and Sunni Muslims consider the Ahmadiyas as heretics and have them killed. They're killed in Pakistan, and they are in the United Kingdom. One of them, a shopkeeper, was killed. Will Sunni Muslims be charged with Islamophobia against Ahmadiyas? And what about people like Rahil Raza, who's a great champion for freedom here, a Pakistani Muslim woman in Canada who protests against extremist ideas found in certain Islamic circles? Will she be considered an Islamophobe for speaking against female genital mutilation, apostasy, death for apostasy, and so forth? So, as Dr. Masson correctly pointed out, this is a very muddled situation, very muddled.
Yes.
So again, within Islam, there are many views of what constitutes orthodoxy. And so Islamophobia, each group would claim that they are representing the orthodox position, and they would accuse then the others of that same phobia, you would have thought.
Now it becomes a dilemma.
Now it becomes a dilemma. So again, do you want the government to arbitrate over who's got the correct interpretation of Islam? I mean, the person who's sponsoring this bill, her name is Ikra Khalid. She was the president of the Muslim Association at York University, which is quite a radical group. And that group, among other things, I'm not sure if it was under her presidency or not, but they were promoting men to beat their wives, you know, with certain limitations and so forth, but very quite radical positions within that grouping. And so you would think this is very odd that it should, you know, it's coming forward from this MP rather, and of course it is right next to the massacre, but it's within a day of it. She already had the motion in place. I mean, it's not a direct response. The timing's just rather interesting on that front, and obviously the groundswell of support for that. But again, her own party voted against an Islamophobia motion last year, so it's like, what is going on here? In terms of Ahmadiyya Muslims, what's the name of the Aga Khan?
The Aga Khan is an Ismaili
Muslim, but I mean, again, they're going to have exactly the same
serious
issue.
problems.
Right. So you're thinking, what's going on here? There's a very strange, because I mean, the Prime Minister was taking a lot of flack for flying down to his private island over Christmas, and now this new bill comes forward. A lot of people think, and I happen to be one of them, that this motion is going to lead to a more stringent incursion into Canadian rights and freedoms.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that we have to touch on as well. What is this doing for our freedom of speech? To be able to criticize a religion, and that's okay, because we should be able to respond to a religion. So, to that criticism. So how is this going to affect us? Now, speaking again, not being able to if it passes.
That's me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that what it does is it effectively, it gives one religious group a particular immunity and sanction under the law, which it currently lacks. I mean, we have in Canada, it's one of the fundamental freedoms, it's freedom of religion and expression, which everyone enjoys, irrespective of what religious grouping you belong to. And now it appears with this very specific religious protection, as sort of nebulous as it is, that one group is going to enjoy that protection. Well, it looks like the state is at that point picking the sides of religious positions that it wants to be on, which I think Canadians would find rather extraordinary. I mean, the preamble to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms recognizes the supremacy of God. That's the preamble.
Right.
But it doesn't specify anything beyond that. Well, now it is being specified. And then one of the fundamental rights, the first one is religion and free and
conscience
and expression and conscience. Well, Christians are not going to recognize the supremacy of Allah, and of course, but if this bill is there and it's as nebulous as it appears, and yet as threatening as it suggests it's going to be. I would have thought Christian conscience is most certainly going to be diminished, and in the public square, where Christianity, if you cannot have a public witness, what sort of witness do you have? So it is very, very serious, and certainly witnessing and speaking to Muslims, trying to win them to Christ, is going to bring harsh consequences, and I think that's an obvious point where it's going to concern people. But even the like you said, Tony, the just where it's the abuses within Islam, the way that women are treated in certain communities, and and polygamy and all manner of. I mean, are we going to allow no criticism of that? These are.
Yes,
I mean,
that's a fair question.
Well, George Orwell, in his famous 1984, said, there's a famous quote where the pigs were running the farm, and they said, animals, all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal. And so the problem here is there's this special pandering that's going on. You see, the Criminal Code of Canada already has a section on hate speech, and it says that any hatred that is perpetrated against an identifiable group, whether that's Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and so forth, is a criminal offense. So hatred against Islam, or Muslims that is, hatred is toward people, not an ideology.
Yes.
Islam is an ideology. And so if I show hatred towards an ideology, whether it's Nazism or whether it's totalitarian fascism or Islam or Christianity, whatever it may be, that is not the same as me hating an individual person. So the Criminal Code of Canada says that we cannot perpetrate hatred towards an identifiable group of people. And that is already in the Criminal Code. In other words, the protection of Muslims is inherent already in the system. It's there. So why do we need this Islamophobia added on if it's already a given right? All people in Canada have a right to protection.
Right.
So the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which I have before me, Section 2B says part of those rights are the freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and of the other media of communication, and so forth. So does that give me the freedom of opinion to say, look, I don't believe the Quran is the Word of God. I believe the Bible is the Word of God, and so forth. So what it's doing is it's actually violating the Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
fundamentally.
And this is a serious issue, and this is something I think that if it ever makes it to the Supreme Court, it should be thrown out, because it is a foundational violation of our charter.
But of course, as soon as you press charges on it, you would be accused of the very thing.
Yes,
so
which
you
is
may
the
not make it to
irony.
the court.
To a circle.
Exactly.
And you may not have access to the very thing that's going to alleviate the burden. So it is an oppressive measure, I think, without a doubt.
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing about it, I mean, there are countless angles, and we're going to talk about those angles, doubtless, is that it seems to me that, and we talked about that in relation to the LGBT, the sort of group rights, the fundamental rights and freedoms that Canadians have are rights for individuals.
Yes.
Right.
And because the individual is the most vulnerable minority of all,
Correct.
right? And the main thing that the individual needs rights and freedoms guaranteed against is the incursion of the state. And this gives the state a further power to oppress conscience and freedom under the name of protecting another group. So it's playing a group off against other groups, and effectively it's saying that there is a hierarchy of oppression, and the Muslims, I guess, are the most oppressed of all, and therefore we need to give them special rights to counter that. Now that flies in the face of the actual facts of the matter, because I think in terms of hate crimes in Canada, I think the Jewish community is about 3 times that of Islam.
Yes.
And worldwide,
Yes.
Christians more than any other group in terms of numbers and even percentage, I think. And rising, particularly in Islamic communities. And then every day, I mean, Tony's the expert on this, but there are prayers in mosques that take place in which they curse the Jews and the Christians.
And most recently in Montreal, in Quebec, an imam, and this is available on video. I believe it's available on video, but the article is definitely there. And what this imam does is he prays for Allah to destroy the Jews, to kill all the Jews. And not a word from the Prime Minister's office, not a word from anyone. And so this goes on all the time. In fact, the first surah of the Quran, it's known as Surah Al-Fatiha, in this first surah of the Quran, the very last verse, it talks about how guide us, O Allah, in the right path, which is Islam. But the last verse says, not the way of those who have earned thine eternal anger, your wrath, which are the Jews, or those who've gone astray, which are the Christians. And so there's this conscious emphasis that the Jews are the enemies of Allah. and that they are to be destroyed. And so, once again, is this not Judeophobia? Should not Judeophobia be included
Yes,
into the law? Should we not have Christophobia
I agree.
included in the law? So
I think
this
no
is the
phobia
problem.
should
No
myself.
phobia
It's
at all.
ridiculous,
It's
but-
ridiculous because we already have protections under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It's there. So as Dr. Masson pointed out, what we've got here is a case of special pleading.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we believe that, yes, you can speak against Christianity.
Absolutely.
You could write against Christianity.
The whole prophetic witness
Yes.
in Scripture is against those who are deviating from proper Christian teaching and practice, right? So, and we this is why we have these Charter of Rights and Freedoms, precisely because we recognize the need for that.
Yes.
It's a Christian value. It's also actually a secular value to some degree. I think they borrow it from Christianity, but that's the heritage of this country, and Islamic countries enjoy no such freedom. So I think this is, and I don't even think it's a very thin end, but it is the thin end of the wedge on this, and I think it should bring a great deal of fear among a large number of people, including people who have come to this country to escape that sort of oppression. And so I wonder what sort of pushback from the Muslim community there might be on this, but on the other hand, I do think there's a climate of fear there, genuinely.
Yes.
Particularly among women's groups. And there's a great deal of, it's difficult to hear people speaking clearly on the issue in Canada and speaking and actually calling people out, but, and particularly in light of the terrible attack that happened in Quebec City. Although it's still actually unclear about what happened there. I mean, irrespective of it, 6 people were killed, and this is terrible, but questions about whether the person who did it was just this one white fellow, or whether there were others were involved. And I mean, that would be slightly off topic here anyway, but there's an element in which the government appears like it might be complicit in covering up some of that, and when you see the motion alongside of it, that there might be a reason why that has happened, right?
Sure.
So do you think we're missing the big picture of what consequences that this could really bring? Why is there such an empathy towards this Islamophobia? It seems like it has come out of nowhere. It's cropped up. And now there's this, everybody's on, you look at the newspapers and this is all they're talking about. You see kids, you see signs, you see billboards.
We do. Well, I happen to think the bigger picture is that there's an agenda which I associate with cultural Marxism. Okay. And I see it identity group politics. It's a part of the new politics of the new left in the States since the late 60s, early 70s. In the LGBT community, particularly connected with Herbert Marcuse. And his work on tolerance, among other things, and the inversion of what is meant by tolerance from the Lockean notion of we tolerate people we disagree with to showing no tolerance for those who don't agree with what we say in order to disrupt the status quo and literally to try and subvert it. And that was his aim. And I think that you can see that identity groups who have historical grievances have used this idea of group rights in order not just to advance their rights, but to assert them over other groups. So there's a power play involved in that. And I think Islamophobia is a very clever attempt to, and a recognition that that has power in North American politics and in Western European politics, for that matter. So we can talk about the historic oppression of black slaves in the U.S. We can talk about that and say that Islamic people are experiencing the exact same sort of oppression the gays are and so forth. These are very dissimilar things, I would say. In fact, they're nothing like one another, but they're piggybacking on that sentiment. And again, Islam is a supremacist religion. These others are not. So it's using a similar language, but I think it's a very different thing and a much more dangerous one. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, just the piggyback argument is very apropos to some Muslims identifying themselves with Jews under the Nazi regime, where now you'll see Muslims wearing stars, the yellow stars that the Jews were forced to wear, and they're identifying themselves with the Jews, the oppressed. But I think that's exactly right. If you'll notice that part of the cultural Marxist agenda is to paint Christianity as the arch enemy. Not just Christianity, but anything associated with the West. The nuclear family has to be subverted, and therefore, since the nuclear family is a Christian, based on a Judeo-Christian concept, you not only have to get rid of the nuclear family, which Ontario has done with Bill C-16 and Bill 28 on the federal level, but now you have to see Christianity as the enemy. Christianity is the cause of colonization, the slave trade, getting involved in Middle East politics. They're the cause of
racism.
All types of racism, and therefore the other groups, the oppressed groups, which Islam would come under, would be considered as the oppressed. And who's the oppressor? The Judeo-Christian West. And so this is why many people on the left are very quick to align themselves with the Islamophobic camp.
Common enemy, right?
Yes, to have a common enemy, right? And so the number one enemy in this picture is the Christian church and Western democracy and the values of the West. And that's why you'll notice Prime Minister Trudeau said that Canada has no core identity. He said we are a post-nation state. And so those are very dangerous words, but at the same time,
also
I think indicative.
Flatly untrue.
Flatly untrue.
Yeah.